When World War II began in September 1939, Adolf Hitler believed that wars were decided by the strength of soldiers, the precision of tanks, and the iron will of his generals. The concept of mass production meant little to him. To the Führer, victory depended on discipline and domination, not factories or laborious. His vision of warfare was still bound to the 19th century, where courage, not conveyor belts, won battles. In the early triumphs of Poland and France, this belief seemed justified. The Wehrmacht moved with mechanical precision, lightning fast, overwhelming nations that had not yet understood what total war required. Yet beyond the Atlantic, in a country not yet at war, another kind of power was quietly taking shape, a power Hitler neither understood nor feared until it was too late. While Germany's war machine operated under the rigid control of the Nazi state, the American industrial heartland thrived on freedom and creativity. Across Detroit, Chicago, Seattle, and California's sunny plains, engineers and laborists were already solving problems Hitler hadn't imagined. The United States had not yet entered the conflict, but its factories were humming with a sense of preparation. The country was vast, its resources practically limitless: iron from Minnesota, coal from Pennsylvania, oil from Texas, and copper from Montana. When Roosevelt promised to make America the arsenal of democracy, those words were not political theater, they were a blueprint for industrial warfare. In Germany, factories like Messerschmitt and Krupp were already producing tanks and planes, but they were limited by manpower and method. Hitler's system was authoritarian by design. Every innovation had to be approved, every improvement passed through political channels. Engineers worked under the watchful eyes of party officials who valued loyalty over imagination. The result was perfection without flexibility. Beautiful machines that took too long to build and were impossible to replace quickly. A single German panzer tank required thousands of hours of skilled labor. Meanwhile, in America, a factory that had once built automobiles could retool within weeks to produce aircraft, trucks, or munitions. It wasn't elegance that mattered, it was speed. The philosophy of the American industrialist was different. Henry Ford, whose assembly lines had revolutionized car production 2 decades earlier, saw the same principles could apply to war. Instead of artisans working by hand, he envisioned factories where every worker performed one simple task in a grand mechanical symphony. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, his engineers constructed a facility that stretched nearly a mile long, covering more ground than any factory in the world. It was designed not for luxury but for rhythm, a moving river of metal, tools, and human hands. At its heart was a new kind of weapon, the B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber that could strike deep into enemy territory and return without refueling. When the first blueprints were shown to the public, even Roosevelt's advisors doubted it could be done. To build a bomber required more than skill, it required coordination among hundreds of industries. Aluminum from Pittsburgh, engines from Cleveland, glass from Ohio, tires from Goodyear, and radio systems from Chicago, all had to arrive in perfect synchronization. But Ford's engineers believed in timing as much as talent. They broke down the bomber into thousands of small, repeatable actions, teaching ordinary workers, many of them women and young men who had never touched a machine before, to perform with precision. By the time the plant reached full operation in 1943, a new B-24 rolled off the line every 55 minutes. To Hitler, who received reports of these developments from his intelligence network, such numbers sounded absurd. His ministers mocked the notion of a democratic assembly line. They considered America lazy, disorganized, and distracted by capitalism. They could not understand how a society built on individuality could ever outproduce a nation drilled in obedience. Yet the American system's strength was precisely its freedom. A factory foreman in Detroit could solve a bottleneck on the spot without waiting for orders from above. A woman riveting a wing section could suggest a faster method and see it adopted by her entire line by the next shift. The spirit of innovation flowed upward, not downward, and that was something no totalitarian state could imitate. As 1940 turned to 1941, Germany controlled most of Europe. Its factories ran on forced labor, prisoners from Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, who worked under brutal conditions with minimal food and constant surveillance. The machines they built were powerful, but the hands that assembled them trembled with exhaustion and fear. In contrast, American workers volunteered for overtime, driven by pride and patriotism. The hum of machinery became the soundtrack of freedom. At night, lights from Boeing's plant in Seattle glowed like a second sun, while rail cars carried endless cargoes of parts toward the coasts. When Hitler's armies invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, he believed he was unstoppable. His blitzkrieg rolled across the steppes, devouring territory faster than the world could react. But behind the curtain of smoke and conquest, the United States, still technically neutral, was already gearing up for a global confrontation. American factories began producing planes, tanks, and ammunition for Britain and the Soviets through the Lend-Lease program. Shipyards in California launched cargo vessels by the hundreds. Automobile plants turned into tank foundries overnight. The scale was staggering. In 1939, America had produced barely 3,000 aircraft. By 1944, it would build nearly 100,000 in a single year. To Hitler, whose industrial doctrine was rooted in control, such expansion was unimaginable. In Berlin, Albert Speer, his armaments minister, pleaded for more flexibility, more autonomy for German engineers. But Hitler resisted. He saw factories as extensions of his will, not engines of collective creativity. By the time he realized that industry, not ideology, would decide the war, it was already too late. German factories bombed by the Allies could not recover fast enough. Each loss crippled the Reich supply chain. In contrast, American production absorbed every setback and grew stronger with each passing month. By the time the United States formally entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the transformation was complete. The industrial engine that had once built cars and radios now churned out bombers, tanks, and rifles with unrelenting precision. It was the greatest mobilization of manpower and machinery the world had ever seen, an orchestra of steel conducted by democracy itself. Every factory whistle, every conveyor belt, every spark from a welder's torch became part of the same symphony, the sound of a free nation preparing for total war. Hitler would never fully grasp what had been unleashed. He had built his empire on fear and control. America built its power on ingenuity and belief. The contrast was fatal. In Germany, one man's vision ruled millions. In America, millions of visions created one unstoppable force. And when the first squadrons of B-24 Liberators lifted off from their runways and disappeared into the clouds, they carried with them more than bombs. They carried the industrial heartbeat of a nation that had learned how to turn liberty into firepower. By the end of 1940, Europe was engulfed in flames. London burned under nightly air raids, France lay defeated, and Hitler's armies stood poised to dominate the continent. Across the Atlantic, the United States remained officially neutral, but its leader, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, saw the writing on the wall. He understood that if Britain fell, the Axis powers would control the world's industrial heartlands, and democracy itself would be cornered. In December 1940, Roosevelt addressed the American people in a radio broadcast that would change the direction of history. His voice, calm yet urgent, declared that the United States must become the great arsenal of democracy. The phrase was more than rhetoric. It was a national mission. It meant that the factories, farms, and shipyards of America would no longer serve only their citizens. They would supply the entire free world. The announcement transformed the nation overnight. Every factory whistle, every hammer strike, and every flicker of a welding torch became part of a grand mobilization. Industrial leaders who had built cars, refrigerators, or washing machines were suddenly asked to build engines of war. The government formed the War Production Board to coordinate output, allocating steel, rubber, and fuel with military precision. The automobile industry, centered in Detroit, became the backbone of this new war economy. The same assembly lines that had produced Bix and Fords were stripped down and rebuilt to produce tanks, jeeps, and aircraft. Factories that once smelled of oil and paint now echoed with the metallic rhythm of military construction. One of the most extraordinary transformations took place in Michigan, at a place called Willow Run. Henry Ford, already a legend for inventing the moving assembly line, saw a challenge unlike any he had faced before: to mass-produce heavy bombers the same way he had once mass-produced cars. The Army Air Forces needed a bomber that could fly thousands of miles, carry heavy payloads, and be built fast enough to outpace losses. Ford's engineers partnered with Consolidated Aircraft to design a plant on an unimaginable scale, a single building covering 67 acres with over 40,000 workers. The building was so vast that employees used bicycles to move from one end to the other. Ford applied the principles of automotive production to the sky. Instead of handcrafted aircraft built one at a time, the B-24 Liberator would be constructed in stages, each worker performing one precise task as the fuselage advanced along the line. The workforce that filled Willow Run was unlike anything the country had seen. Men who had been mechanics, miners, and farmers now worked alongside women who had never before set foot in a factory. Housewives, students, and mothers became welders and riveters, trading aprons for overalls. The image of Rosie the Riveter, her arm flexed beneath a red bandana, came to symbolize this revolution. In Detroit, women comprised nearly one-third of the industrial labor force by 1943. They learned quickly, often surpassing expectations. What had begun as a social experiment turned into a logistical miracle. Each worker specialized in a single action, riveting panels, installing instruments, or sealing joints, and the result was a choreography of precision and endurance. They called her Rosie the Riveter, a symbol born from a 1942 song that swept through factory radios, celebrating the women who were making history, working for victory. What began as propaganda soon became reality. In Detroit, California, and the industrial towns of the Midwest, millions of women poured into jobs once considered impossible for them. By the end of the war, more than 6 million women had joined the labor force. They came from every corner of society, 18-year-old girls from Iowa farms, grandmothers from Ohio, and black women from Alabama who finally found an opportunity to earn equal pay for equal work. In the hangars of Boeing, the workshops of North American Aviation, and the vast halls of the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, they stood shoulder to shoulder with engineers, mechanics, and returning soldiers on leave. The transformation was not just numerical, it was cultural. Before the war, women were expected to support from home. Now, they were called to action. In factories that operated around the clock, they became welders, electricians, machinists, and crane operators. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, women built Liberty ships faster than any shipyard in history. At Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica, they drilled rivets into the wings of bombers destined for Europe. Their hands were often blistered, their overalls smeared with oil, but their work carried an unshakable pride. Each finished aircraft represented more than machinery. It was a declaration that democracy had found strength in every citizen willing to serve. In contrast, Hitler's Germany relied on coercion and fear. The Nazi war economy drew heavily on forced labor, enslaving millions of prisoners from occupied nations. Men and women from Poland, France, and the Soviet Union were dragged into factories, starved, and made to produce weapons for a cause they despised. Their output, though significant, was unsustainable. Sabotage was common. Morale was non-existent. Machines built under duress broke more easily. Production schedules collapsed under the weight of cruelty. The difference was clear. Where Germany's labor force worked from fear, America's worked from purpose. The freedom to choose gave birth to precision, pride, and progress. The sheer scale of America's industrial transformation defied belief. At Willow Run, workers, many of them women, assembled one B-24 Liberator bomber every 55 minutes. In California, at the Vega Aircraft Corporation, women dominated the production of the Lockheed Ventura. They learned to read blueprints, handle pneumatic drills, and weld aluminum seams that had to be flawless under pressure. The same was true at the Glen L. Martin plant in Maryland, where teams of women constructed B-26 Marauders, their laughter mixing with the rhythmic pounding of rivet guns. In each plant, supervisors who once doubted women's capabilities were forced to admit the truth. Their output matched or exceeded that of the men who had gone to war. Even outside the major factories, the mobilization spread. In small towns, sewing groups stitched parachutes, while rural women produced uniforms and medical supplies. Universities trained women in chemistry and engineering for the first time, and their discoveries improved fuel efficiency and aircraft materials. African American women, long excluded from industrial labor, found a place in war production despite facing prejudice and segregation. In Tuskegee, Alabama, women worked to maintain the planes used by the Tuskegee Airmen, the first black fighter pilots in U.S. history. In doing so, they proved that the struggle for equality and the fight against fascism were two sides of the same coin. By 1943, nearly 1 out of every 3 defense workers in the United States was female. Their presence redefined the American workplace. Factories adapted with new safety measures, restrooms, and uniforms designed for women. Daycare centers were established near industrial hubs so mothers could work without fear of neglecting their children. The government launched massive propaganda campaigns to celebrate their contributions. Posters and newsreels showed women at work, their faces illuminated by sparks from welding torches. "The more women at work, the sooner we win," read one banner above the entrance to an aircraft factory in Seattle. It was more than a slogan, it was a truth measured in tons of steel, thousands of planes, and countless victories overseas. Hitler's intelligence analysts, when confronted with reports of American production, dismissed them as exaggerations. Yet by the middle of the war, the numbers told their own story. For every German Messerschmitt fighter that rolled off the assembly line, the United States produced 10 bombers. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, began to run out of planes and fuel. Allied formations of B-17s and B-24s filled the skies over Europe, their wings stretching from horizon to horizon. Each bomber carried not only bombs but also the fingerprints of the women who built them, proof that freedom could outbuild tyranny. Hitler had gambled that terror, ideology, and obedience would ensure victory. He had underestimated the quiet determination of ordinary citizens halfway across the world. The success of America's female workforce was not simply measured in numbers or output. It redefined the nation's social fabric. The experience of industrial labor gave women financial independence and a voice that would resonate long after the war ended. When peace returned in 1945, many were told to leave their jobs for returning soldiers. Yet the taste of contribution and equality could not be undone. The post-war women's movement, the fight for civil rights, and the evolution of workplace equality all drew strength from those wartime years when a rivet gun in a woman's hand symbolized both freedom and power. For Germany, the consequences of ignoring its human potential were devastating. The Nazi regime had restricted women largely to domestic roles, believing their duty was to motherhood and obedience. Even in crisis, Hitler refused to mobilize German women for factory work on the same scale as the Allies, fearing it would weaken his image of masculine dominance. This decision crippled the Reich's industrial capacity. While American women fueled production, Hitler's empire ran on fear, overwork, and exhaustion. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing, its pilots flying outdated or poorly maintained aircraft. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American factories staffed by women who worked in 12-hour shifts without complaint continued to send bombers, tanks, and ammunition in waves too large to counter. The war of machines had become a war of hearts and hands, and America's strength lay in both. Each rivet driven into the fuselage of a bomber echoed across oceans and battlefields, a metallic heartbeat of liberty. Hitler's world was crumbling not only because of bombs dropped from the sky, but because he had failed to understand the true source of power in modern war, the collective effort of free people. In every gleaming B-24 that soared above Europe, there was a trace of lipstick on a coffee mug, a woman's signature inside a wing panel, a silent promise of victory forged by faith, labor, and unity. And that promise, born in the hands of women who had never before been invited into history, became one of the greatest weapons democracy ever built. By 1942, the outcome of the war increasingly depended on who could control the skies. The Germans had mastered the art of blitzkrieg, swift ground assaults supported by precise airstrikes, but the Allies were learning to fight from a new altitude. The machine that would make this possible was not beautiful by design or revered for its aesthetics. It was bulky, temperamental, and mechanically demanding, but it had something no German aircraft could match: range, payload, and numbers. The B-24 Liberator was a fortress with wings, a symbol of a country that had turned its factories into engines of vengeance. It did not glide, it thundered. Where it flew, the war began to tilt. The B-24 was born out of necessity. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed a long-range heavy bomber that could reach deep into occupied Europe and the Pacific without refueling, carry heavier loads than the B-17 Flying Fortress, and be built faster. Consolidated Aircraft Corporation of San Diego delivered the answer. Its engineers, led by Reuben Fleet and Isaac Macklin Laddon, created a revolutionary design with a high-aspect Davis wing that gave the aircraft greater lift and range than anything in service. Its four Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines provided the raw power needed to lift 8,000 pounds of bombs and 10.50 caliber Browning machine guns. The new bomber could climb higher, fly farther, and strike harder than its rivals. Its range exceeded 2,000 miles, allowing it to attack oil refineries in Ploietti, shipyards in Kiel, and airfields deep inside France. Yet what truly made the B-24 legendary was not its design, it was its production. No weapon in history had ever been built on such a scale. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, operated by Ford, became the industrial cathedral of American air power. At its peak, it employed more than 42,000 workers and ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Conveyor belts moved fuselages through stations like a moving city, while cranes lifted wings into place with mathematical precision. From the riveters to the mechanics, from the women who installed radio equipment to the men who painted the insignia on the tail fins, nearly 1 million Americans touched some part of a B-24. The bomber became a symbol of collective labor, a metallic embodiment of democracy's industrial strength. On the ground, its sheer presence was overwhelming. A fully armed Liberator stretched 67 feet in length with a wingspan of 110 feet. On takeoff, its engines shook the earth, leaving behind trails of black smoke as it clawed for altitude. When hundreds of them rose together, their silver bodies caught the morning sun, forming a rolling mirror across the sky. Pilots described the roar as the sound of America itself. From a distance, the formations looked like storm clouds. Up close, they were a storm of steel. Each aircraft carried 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 5 gunners. Their lives depended on the precision of strangers they would never meet, workers who had assembled each bolt and cable thousands of miles away. The first Liberators entered combat in 1942, flying with the 8th Air Force in Europe and the 10th Air Force in the Pacific. Their impact was immediate. In August 1943, 177 B-24s launched one of the most daring missions of the war, Operation Tidal Wave, the low-altitude bombing of Romania's oil fields at Ploietti. It was a mission that changed the perception of air power forever. Flying just a few hundred feet above the ground, the bombers attacked heavily defended refineries that supplied nearly half of Germany's fuel. 41 planes were lost and hundreds of airmen killed, but the assault crippled production for months. German officers were stunned by the scale and audacity of the raid. Hitler's intelligence officers, already alarmed by reports of US factories turning out bombers by the hour, realized that no defense could stop a nation capable of such persistence. The Luftwaffe, once the master of the skies, began to falter under the pressure. Germany's factories, strained by Allied bombings and shortages of materials, could not keep pace. Each downed German fighter was a loss that took weeks to replace, while every American loss was offset within hours. The Luftwaffe pilots began referring to the incoming formations as Fliegenfabriken, flying factories, because each bomber represented an entire production chain of unimaginable size and efficiency. They were right. Every B-24 carried within its aluminum frame the work of miners, machinists, electricians, and welders from every corner of the United States. The B-24 also transformed the geography of war. In the Pacific, its range allowed it to bomb Japanese positions from bases as far as India and Australia. Its versatility meant it could perform reconnaissance, anti-submarine patrols, and cargo transport. The Navy version, the PB-4Y1, became a scourge of German U-boats in the Atlantic. At the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, Liberators equipped with radar and depth charges closed the deadly mid-Atlantic gap, the area where Allied convoys had once been defenseless against submarines. Within months, U-boat losses soared, and the Atlantic lifeline was secured. By 1944, the numbers spoke for themselves. The United States had produced over 18,000 B-24s, more than any other heavy bomber in history. They filled the airfields of England, North Africa, and Italy, ready to unleash a wave of destruction that even Hitler's most optimistic generals could not deny. On missions over Germany, entire cities trembled beneath the steady rhythm of their engines. The skies above Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne became highways of Allied power, where bombers flew in tight box formations protected by P-51 Mustang fighters. The Luftwaffe, once feared for its dominance, was bleeding to death. Pilots who had ruled the air during the early years of the war now faced armadas they could barely penetrate. For every bomber shot down, 10 more replaced it. The men who flew the B-24s paid a heavy price. Their missions lasted up to 10 hours, their cabins freezing, and their aircraft constantly under fire. Oxygen masks iced over, flak ripped through wings and fuselages. Yet they kept flying. Each time a bomber returned riddled with holes and still made it home, it became a testament to American engineering and determination. Inside the cockpits, crews taped photographs of loved ones to the controls. They named their planes after wives, girlfriends, or hometowns: the Dragon and His Tail, Witchcraft, Strawberry Bitch. Each name told a story, and together they formed a chorus of resilience. Hitler could no longer deny the truth. His empire, built on ideology and terror, was being dismantled by assembly lines and mechanics in overalls. The German High Command had underestimated the power of industrial warfare. They had built weapons as art. America built them as necessity. Each hour, another bomber joined the fight. The relentless rhythm of American production made time itself an ally. By the spring of 1944, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. It belonged to the factories of Detroit, San Diego, and Fort Worth. The B-24 was more than a machine of war. It was a message. It carried the proof that democracy, when mobilized, could outbuild, outfly, and outfight tyranny. It represented the hands of millions who never saw combat but fought with rivets and wrenches. When the thunder of its engines echoed over occupied Europe, it wasn't just steel that filled the sky, it was the sound of freedom mass-produced. By 1943, the balance of power in the air was no longer a contest of courage but of endurance. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler clung to the belief that willpower and ideology could triumph over material strength. He dismissed reports from his generals that American and British factories were producing planes faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. To him, the German spirit, disciplined, loyal, and fanatically devoted, was worth 10 times the strength of any foreign laborer. What he failed to grasp was that modern war had entered a new era. It was no longer won by passion but by production. The age of the soldier had become the age of the machine. The numbers told the story that ideology refused to accept. In 1943 alone, the United States produced nearly 86,000 aircraft, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. The scale of this industrial surge defied comprehension. Factories like Boeing in Seattle, North American Aviation in Inglewood, and Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica ran without pause, day and night, powered by more than 2.5 million workers. Conveyor belts rolled endlessly, welders sparked through midnight shifts, and airfields across the country became oceans of metal and propellers. Every corner of America was part of the effort. Farmers supplied aluminum scrap, students trained as mechanics, and even small-town workshops received contracts to produce parts for planes and tanks. It was an entire civilization turned into a single, unstoppable engine. In Germany, the situation was the opposite. Allied bombings had turned the once proud industrial heart of the Reich into smoldering ruins. The great centers of production, Essen, Hamburg, Cologne, were pounded repeatedly by waves of bombers that seemed endless. The Luftwaffe fought bravely, but its resources were crumbling. Fuel supplies dwindled, and every month, fewer pilots returned from missions. Replacement training programs collapsed under the strain, leaving young, inexperienced flyers to face enemy squadrons with little more than basic instruction. Even when new aircraft models like the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Messerschmitt Me 262 appeared, there was no fuel to fly them and no time to produce them in sufficient numbers. Hitler refused to see the reality. He ordered his ministers to demand total war from the German population, calling for every man and woman to sacrifice comfort for victory. But total war required total resources, and those were gone. Albert Speer, his Minister of Armaments, tried to modernize production by introducing assembly line methods and central coordination, yet even his reforms came too late. Rail networks were shattered, and supply chains choked under relentless Allied raids. By 1944, nearly half of Germany's industrial workforce consisted of foreign slave laborers, most of them malnourished and desperate. Productivity plummeted. Every day, the gap between American abundance and German exhaustion widened. In contrast, America's economy thrived on energy and unity. Factories didn't just build aircraft, they improved them. Boeing produced the B-17 Flying Fortress in record numbers, while North American Aviation perfected the P-51 Mustang, the long-range fighter that would escort bombers deep into enemy territory. The Douglas Company supplied the versatile C-47 transport planes that carried troops and supplies across continents. Even Lockheed's engineers developed radar-equipped aircraft capable of night bombing, ensuring that the war in the air never stopped. The production line had become as vital as the front line. For every German plane that crashed in flames, 5 new American aircraft took to the sky. When Allied bombers rained destruction on German cities, Hitler demanded revenge. He ordered new offensives, new weapons, and new promises. His faith shifted from reality to fantasy, miracle solutions that would never come. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, while technologically remarkable, drained critical resources without changing the course of the war. These vengeance weapons were born from desperation, not strategy. They symbolized a dictator's last attempt to intimidate the world through terror rather than power. Meanwhile, Allied formations grew larger and more precise. Radar-guided bombing runs targeted oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, and rail depots, the arteries of Hitler's war machine. Each loss was a wound the Reich could not heal. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. The air battles over Germany became massacres. In the skies above Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Berlin, formations of American bombers stretched for miles, guarded by P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. The German pilots who once dominated Europe were now outnumbered, outgunned, and running on fumes. Even the most experienced aces admitted defeat. One pilot described the experience bitterly: "For every plane we shot down, 10 more took its place before the next sunrise." The factory, not the battlefield, had become the ultimate weapon. Inside his bunker, Hitler still issued orders as if numbers and logic did not exist. He blamed his generals for cowardice, his engineers for failure, and his people for weakness. But the truth was far simpler. He had miscalculated the nature of modern war. He believed fear could replace fuel, and ideology could substitute for steel. Yet the world had changed. The same assembly lines that once built American automobiles now produced engines of liberation, and the same citizens who once made toys and radios now forged the tools of victory. Hitler had bet on terror. America had bet on teamwork. By the time 1944 arrived, the skies over Europe told the full story of that miscalculation. German cities burned beneath clouds of Allied aircraft, their silhouettes shimmering in the smoke. Every new bomber represented not just a weapon but a system of values, a belief that freedom could outproduce tyranny. The Reich still possessed courage and discipline, but wars were no longer decided by the spirit of men alone. They were decided by those who could harness the power of industry, organization, and will. And in that arena, Hitler never stood a chance. In the end, it wasn't bravery that Germany lacked. It was fuel to fly, metal to build, and time to recover, the 3 resources that America had mastered. The war Hitler imagined, a contest of strength and destiny, was lost the moment he underestimated the factory floor. By 1944, the world was divided between 2 realities, one shrinking under the weight of destruction, and another expanding through the power of creation. Hitler's empire was collapsing, its borders retreating with every passing month, while across the Atlantic, the United States had built something greater than an army. It had built an industrial empire. America's cities were no longer just places of commerce. They had become arsenals, laboratories, and foundries of freedom. Every furnace, lathe, and conveyor belt became a weapon in its own right. The war that began in Europe's trenches was now being fought in the factories of Detroit, Los Angeles, and Chicago, where the rhythm of production replaced the sound of gunfire. In California, the Douglas Aircraft Company was a marvel of scale and speed. Its engineers and workers produced aircraft wings so massive that bicycles were used to navigate the assembly floors. The Santa Monica plant stretched over 60 acres, employing more than 30,000 men and women who worked in shifts that never stopped. Here, planes like the C-47 Skytrain and the A-20 Havoc rolled off the lines with a precision that stunned visiting officials. The sound inside the plant was constant, a symphony of drills, hammers, and voices shouting above the din of progress. Workers often said that the factory floor felt like a small city, alive with motion and purpose, every part of it moving toward victory. Farther east, in Ohio, the Packard Motor Car Company had transformed from a luxury car manufacturer into an engine supplier for warplanes. Its engineers designed and built the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that powered Britain's iconic Spitfires and later the American P-51 Mustangs. Each engine was an intricate masterpiece, made with such precision that one mechanic's error could mean a lost pilot thousands of miles away. Yet mistakes were rare. Packard's motto during the war, excellence under pressure, captured the spirit of the entire nation. Factories that once competed for customers now competed for efficiency. There were no rivals, only allies. Industrial secrets were shared, patents exchanged, and production synchronized on a scale that no authoritarian system could have achieved. In Chicago, General Motors embodied the versatility of American manufacturing. One moment it produced cars, the next it was manufacturing tank treads, aircraft parts, and Browning machine guns under the same roof. The plant's massive forges glowed through the night, turning raw steel into weapons of survival. Entire families worked there, fathers on the foundry line, daughters in the inspection department, sons serving overseas. The unity of purpose bridged every social divide. Labor strikes vanished, and competition gave way to collaboration. Private companies, once driven purely by profit, now answered directly to the War Production Board, which balanced civilian needs with military demands. The result was an unprecedented harmony between government, industry, and citizens. The sheer scale of output defied imagination. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built more than 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 1.2 million machine guns, and nearly 40 billion bullets. It produced one new ship every 4 days, one new bomber every hour, and one new bullet every second. Steel plants in Pennsylvania operated at 95% capacity, while aluminum production quadrupled within 3 years. The Kaiser shipyards on the West Coast built Liberty ships so quickly that one was launched after just 4 days of assembly, a feat no nation had ever matched. Every launch was celebrated like a small victory, complete with music, speeches, and the christening of a vessel that would soon carry supplies across the Atlantic. The empire of production was not built by soldiers but by ordinary citizens with extraordinary resolve. Housewives who had never touched machinery became welders. Farmers learned to assemble engines. College students trained as draftsmen and engineers. In places like Wichita, Kansas, known as the air capital of the world, small factories expanded into industrial giants almost overnight. Boeing's workforce there grew from 1,700 to over 30,000 in less than 2 years. Cities across the country pulsed with a new rhythm of labor. The night sky glowed from the lights of factories that refused to sleep, each one beating like a heart pumping lifeblood into the war effort. Meanwhile, inside the Reich, the opposite was true. Germany's production lines were fragmented and chaotic. Allied bombings decimated infrastructure faster than it could be repaired. The Reich's dependence on slave labor destroyed morale and efficiency. Resources that should have gone to rebuilding factories were squandered on experimental weapons, like jet fighters and long-range rockets, that offered spectacle but little strategic value. The Nazis' obsession with innovation for prestige rather than practicality crippled their ability to keep pace. Where Hitler demanded perfection, America demanded productivity, and in war, productivity wins. The success of the American system lay not only in its technology but in its cooperation. Thousands of small businesses received government contracts to produce parts, from ball bearings to parachutes. The federal government coordinated logistics through rail networks and shipping routes that spanned the continent. The Office of War Information launched campaigns to conserve materials and prevent waste. Citizens collected scrap metal, rubber, and paper for recycling, transforming domestic waste into weapons of war. Even Hollywood joined in, producing films and newsreels that glorified industrial heroes as much as soldiers. The narrative was clear: every worker was a combatant, every machine a battlefield, and every shift a victory. By late 1944, Hitler had entered a world he could neither understand nor control. Battles were no longer decided by generals on the field but by engineers, machinists, and welders in the factories. While the Luftwaffe gasped for fuel, America's refineries drowned in it. While German factories rebuilt after every air raid, new American plants were already breaking ground. The Reich's borders shrank, but America's industrial reach expanded across oceans, supplying not only its own forces but also Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. It was an empire without conquest, an empire of steel, smoke, and determination. In the end, Hitler's greatest miscalculation was believing that tyranny could outlast creativity. The Third Reich was built on obedience, but America's power came from initiative, from millions of free minds working toward one goal. The workers with wrenches had become the true commanders of the war. Their empire was not marked by flags or frontiers, but by production lines that stretched from coast to coast, fueling a global fight for freedom. In that empire, the roar of engines replaced the sound of speeches, and history was written not with ink or ideology but with the sparks of industry. By 1944, the skies over Europe had become the new front line of civilization. From the English coast to the heart of Germany, the air trembled with the thunder of Allied bombers. Every dawn brought a spectacle of power, formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators stretching from horizon to horizon, their silver bodies gleaming in the rising sun. The noise was not just mechanical, it was symbolic, the sound of democracy in motion. Germany's cities, once untouchable, now lived beneath a sky that promised fire. The Allied air campaign had evolved into a force of nature. Factories that once produced engines and ammunition for the Reich were reduced to rubble. Railways that carried troops and supplies became twisted wreckage. The synthetic fuel plants of Luna and Politz, vital to keeping Hitler's tanks and planes moving, were bombed relentlessly until production collapsed. American bombers built in Michigan or California were dropping explosives over Munich and Berlin only weeks after leaving the assembly line. It was industrial war in its purest form, a nation of builders dismantling an empire of conquest. For the Luftwaffe, the transformation was catastrophic. In the early years of the war, German pilots had ruled the skies, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs feared across continents. But by 1944, they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outproduced. Every time a German squadron scrambled to meet an incoming wave, it was swallowed by sheer quantity. The Luftwaffe's fuel reserves dwindled to a fraction of what was needed, forcing pilots to ration flight hours. Many young recruits went into combat with barely 30 hours of training. Some had never fired their guns before facing an enemy formation. Their commanders watched in despair as experienced aces were replaced by boys who did not survive their first mission. The shift was visible even to those on the ground. Civilians in Berlin and Hamburg learned to distinguish the sound of approaching engines. A deep rolling hum meant hundreds were coming. When the sirens wailed, there was no longer panic, only resignation. Entire neighborhoods disappeared overnight. The glow of burning cities could be seen for miles, and the smell of smoke and ash hung permanently in the air. Hitler's propaganda machine called it temporary hardship. His people called it survival. Yet the reality was inescapable. Germany was being bombed into paralysis. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler still refused to accept defeat. He ordered new offensives and demanded miracle weapons to reverse the tide. The V-2 rockets launched against London were meant to prove that Germany still held the power to strike back. But they were drops of terror in an ocean of destruction. The Allies, driven by production and precision, could lose 50 bombers in a raid and replace them before the next sunrise. Germany could not replace a single oil refinery or 1,000 trained pilots. The arithmetic of war had turned irreversible. In one of the most decisive campaigns, Operation Argument, known to airmen as Big Week, the Allies attacked every major aircraft factory in Germany. From February 20th to 25th, 1944, more than 3,000 bombers struck targets across the Reich. The losses were heavy, but the results were decisive. Aircraft production fell by half, and the Luftwaffe never recovered. By the time Allied ground forces landed in Normandy that June, the skies were already won. German divisions fought blind beneath an enemy that owned the air. The Luftwaffe, once the symbol of Hitler's military genius, was dying, not from lack of courage, but from starvation. It starved for fuel, for aluminum, for trained men, for time. Each Allied bomb that fell on a German factory was not just destroying machinery, it was erasing the future of the Reich. Hitler's commanders finally understood what he never would. No nation can win a modern war by ideology alone. You cannot outfight a country that can replace every loss faster than you can bury it. The turning of the sky marked the turning of the war, and from that moment forward, the outcome was only a matter of time. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Berlin was no longer a capital, it was a scar on the earth. Entire districts had vanished beneath mountains of rubble. Streets were littered with the skeletons of factories that had once fueled Hitler's ambitions, and the Reichstag stood hollow, its flag of conquest burned to ash. The ruins were not just physical, they were the ruins of an idea. Hitler's dream of eternal domination had been buried under the weight of his own arrogance. Across the Atlantic, however, another idea had triumphed. one that proved a nation's true power was not measured by the size of its army, but by the strength of its unity and belief. The contrast between defeat and victory could not have been clearer. Germany's cities lay in ruins, while America's industrial empire hummed with life. The same assembly lines that had once forged the weapons of liberation now returned to producing the tools of peace. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where thousands of men and women had labored day and night to assemble B-24 Liberators, the clatter of rivet guns faded, replaced by the hum of automotive machinery. Workers who had once built bombers for war began building cars for a renewed world. They rarely thought of themselves as heroes, yet their hands had shaped the outcome of history. Each bolt they had tightened, each engine they had mounted, had carried the promise of freedom across oceans and continents. The United States had emerged from the war not merely as a victor but as a lesson in what free societies could accomplish when united under a shared purpose. In less than 4 years, it had transformed from a nation of consumers into the greatest producer the world had ever known. It had not conquered land, it had conquered impossibility. Factories once thought incapable of military production had learned to build tanks, ships, and planes faster than any empire in history. But the most important victory was moral. America had proven that when individuals were trusted, when creativity was unleashed rather than controlled, industry could become an unstoppable weapon. It was not the machinery that won the war, it was the people who built it. Across Europe, the lessons of industrial democracy began to reshape the future. Nations rebuilding from the ashes turned to the American model of cooperation between government, workers, and private industry. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, carried not only billions in aid but also the philosophy that had won the war: progress through partnership, not domination. The same factories that once supplied the Allied front now supplied a recovering world with vehicles, machinery, and tools for reconstruction. America's wartime miracle became the blueprint for peace, proving that prosperity could spread faster than destruction if guided by shared vision and purpose. For Germany, the aftermath was a mirror of its errors. Hitler had believed fear could replace innovation and obedience could replace initiative. But his empire, built on coercion, collapsed the moment its people could no longer be forced to work. America's victory revealed a deeper truth, that genuine strength comes from empowerment, not control. The workers who riveted the wings of bombers or packed crates of ammunition had done so not out of fear but conviction. They believed in something larger than themselves, and that belief had powered an army of machines no dictator could rival. The war's final years had taught a lesson that would echo far beyond the 1940s. Power built on tyranny is brittle. It cracks under the weight of its own lies. Power built on freedom, on the will of millions acting in harmony, endures. Every bomber that once soared through the clouds carried that truth with it, a message written not in ink, but in smoke and sunlight. The factories of Detroit and the shipyards of California had proven that liberty, when tested, could forge steel as strong as conviction. Hitler never understood that. He mistook obedience for unity and control for strength. In the end, his empire burned, while the democracies he scorned took flight. The legacy of that industrial triumph still lingers. It lives in every modern factory, every collaboration born from open minds rather than closed fists. The war may have been won in the skies, but the foundation of victory was laid on the factory floor, among the workers who turned belief into machinery, and machinery into freedom. From the ashes of war rose a single enduring lesson: nations rise and fall by the spirit of their people, not the commands of their rulers. And as the smoke cleared over a broken Europe, one truth soared higher than any bomber that had crossed its skies: power built on tyranny collapses, but power built on freedom flies.